Hello and welcome. This video was created to help people relax or sleep. With this in mind, I only put 3 ads in the entire video after the first 3 stories. Most of the stories in this video are allegedly true and actually happened. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and like the video. Lastly, thank you for being here when you have so many other choices. Now let's begin. The night was cold, quiet, and still. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the empty halls of St. Lawrence Memorial Hospital, where the only sound was the soft shuffle of Evelyn's footsteps as she made her way down the long corridor. It was nearly midnight. Her shift was almost over, and the hospital felt like it was asleep. She had always enjoyed the quiet hours, the stillness that came with working the graveyard shift. The hustle of the day had long faded, and the world outside seemed to drift away as she moved through the building, checking on patients, filling out paperwork, and completing the various tasks that kept her busy. Soon her brain completed the translator and switched on. The morgue was part of her nightly routine. She had to check on the bodies, make sure everything was in order. It was an unspoken rule at the hospital. No one liked the job, but someone had to do it, and tonight, like every other night, it was Evelyn's turn. As she passed the old stairwell that led to the morgue, she noticed a strange chill in the air. It wasn't just the usual coolness of the hospital's aging air conditioning. It was something else. A subtle draft, a shiver that crept up her spine. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but the feeling lingered. When she reached the morgue's heavy steel door, something felt off. The lock. It was slightly out of place, not enough to be fully open, but enough for her to notice. A quiet alarm went off in her mind, but she shook it off. It was probably just the wind. Or the janitors. She took a deep breath and turned the key. The door creaked open slowly, the sound unsettling in the otherwise silent hallway. Inside, the morgue was just as she remembered. The cold, sterile room was lined with metal drawers, each one containing a body, each one an untold story. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of old, dust-covered surfaces. The overhead lights flickered briefly before settling into their usual dim glow. Evelyn made her way to the first drawer, the soft sound of her shoes against the linoleum floor the only noise. As she reached for the clipboard by the door, she heard it. A whisper. It was so faint that she wasn't sure if it was real, but it made her pause. Her eyes scanned the room, her heart suddenly racing in her chest. There was nothing there. The room was empty. The bodies lay still, silent. Strange, the doctor said. Silent. She exhaled, trying to shake off the unease that crept over her. The air felt colder now, and her fingers trembled as she reached for the first drawer to check on the body inside. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the pale form of the deceased. Everything was in order. But as she turned to the next drawer, she heard it again, a faint, scratching sound. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. It was coming from one of the drawers. With slow, hesitant steps, Evelyn turned toward the source of the sound. The drawer in question was just slightly ajar, and she couldn't stop herself from moving toward it. She reached for the handle, her fingers cold against the metal. Still, the scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. She opened the drawer, her hands shaking as she did, and there, at the edge of the body, she saw it. A finger. Cold, pale, and lifeless. It twitched. Evelyn gasped, stumbling backward, her pulse racing. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for what she had just seen. And then, as though the air itself had become thick with tension, she heard it. A whisper. Evelyn. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the cold, silent morgue. And yet, something was watching her. Evelyn stood frozen in the dim light of the morgue, her heart thundering in her chest. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as if it were pressing in from all sides. The silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Heavy, filled with something she couldn't name, something dark. A knife block. Her eyes darted from drawer to drawer, expecting to see something move, something out of place. But everything was still. The body in the drawer, the one she had just opened, lay motionless, as it should. There was no twitching finger, no sign of life. The whisper had stopped, too. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had worked here for years, and nothing like this had ever occurred before. The hospital was old, yes, but it wasn't haunted. She had been through worse. Noises, shadows, those were just part of the job, but tonight was different. Evelyn shook her head, trying to clear the fog of unease that had settled over her. It was just her imagination, she told herself. She was tired, stressed from the long shift. Maybe she was hearing things. She glanced back at the body she had just checked. The finger had stopped moving, and there was no sign that anything was out of the ordinary. Still, her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get out of this room before something else happened. But she couldn't. Some pull kept her rooted to the spot. Her fingers brushed against the cold steel of the drawer, lingering there for a moment. A soft noise broke through the silence. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a distinct sound, like a breath. Shallow, labored. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, her breath shallow as she scanned the room. Nothing. Another breath. Closer this time. She whipped around, eyes darting across the morgue. Her gaze landed on the far corner, where the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally. Her pulse quickened as she took a step forward, her legs unsteady beneath her. The coldness in the room had intensified, and she could feel the temperature drop even further. It was as if the very air had frozen. She took another step, then another, moving slowly, cautiously, toward the shadows. The sound of breathing was louder now, unmistakable. Yura, It was coming from behind the last drawer. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn around and leave, but her body moved on its own. The pull, the sense of something beckoning her forward, was too strong. With trembling hands, she reached for the drawer. The breathing stopped, replaced by an unsettling stillness. She could feel her breath hitch in her throat as she slid the drawer open. But this time, there was no body inside. Only a small, dark space. A void. A hollow. Her eyes widened in confusion. She had just checked this drawer. It had been full of the lifeless form of a man who had passed away days ago. There was no way it was empty. Then, as if on cue, a whisper slithered through the air again, so close to her ear that she felt it, the hairs on her neck standing on end. "Leave, now." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Evelyn spun around, her heart racing, her breaths shallow and panicked. There was no one there. No figure, no movement. Just the cold, empty room. Her thoughts were spinning, her head heavy with the weight of what was happening. She could feel her pulse in her temples, a dull throb that seemed to echo the tension in the room. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave, but she couldn't bring herself to move. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air felt lighter, as though something had lifted, but Evelyn couldn't shake the sensation that she was still being watched. That something was lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. Now, a noise, faint but distinct, echoed from somewhere in the hall, a metallic scrape, like a drawer being pulled open. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, Evelyn realized she wasn't alone. The question gnawed at her. Who or what was it? Her eyes flickered to the door. The exit was just a few steps away, but the longer she stood here, the more she felt a pull toward the dark corners of the morgue. The more she felt like something was waiting for her to stay. A movement in the corner of her eye. A figure. Not quite solid, but there. A shape that flickered in and out of existence like a shadow. A wisp of something that shouldn't be. It stood still, watching her. Evelyn's blood ran cold. And then the whisper returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The flicker smiled. "Help us." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as the shadow in the corner seemed to draw closer. Her body refused to move, rooted to the spot by fear, as the shape grew clearer, more defined. It wasn't a person, but something. Something else. Something that had been waiting. For them. The figure in the corner was like a shadow. Yet not a shadow. It was a presence that clung to the air, a form that flickered and shifted as if it was made of smoke or a memory, half-formed and elusive. Evelyn's breath hitched in her chest as her eyes locked onto it, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The room seemed to grow colder with every passing second, the walls pressing in, suffocating her. The flickering figure, was it a man, a woman, or something else entirely? It didn't have a face, no distinct features to define it, but she could feel its gaze, cold and heavy, on her. "Help us." The voice was clear now. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a desperate plea, strained and filled with an eerie urgency. Evelyn took a step back, her body trembling with fear, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The pull was still there, tugging her forward, urging her to approach. The figure shifted again, its form rippling in the dim light like smoke caught in a breeze. It stretched out an arm, or what seemed like an arm, though it was not quite human. The long, dark tendrils of the shadow flicked in and out of existence, curling and twisting like serpents in the air. "Help us!" The voice came again, more frantic now, and Evelyn could feel the weight of its desperation pressed down on her chest. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a dizzying whirlwind. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion, the stress of her shift. She had to leave. She had to get out of here. But she couldn't. Her body refused to obey her mind, her feet rooted to the spot as the figure continued to reach for her, its movements unnatural, jerky, as if it didn't belong in this world. The temperature in the room dropped even further. Evelyn could see her breath now, a mist forming in the cold air. The shadows seemed to grow larger, its tendrils extending further, creeping toward her like fingers, reaching for her very soul. A soft thud echoed from behind her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, and her eyes landed on the drawers, the ones she had just checked. One of them was open, the body inside it. Gone. Finally, the door at the back of the warehouse swung open, and gone. Her stomach lurched as a wave of nausea hit her. She had checked every drawer. She had seen the bodies, the cold, lifeless forms lying in their steel tombs. But now, one of them was missing. And not only that, there was a trail of dark, viscous liquid leading from the drawer toward the far corner of the room where the shadow figure stood. Her eyes widened in horror as she followed the trail, the liquid pooling in a growing stain on the floor. The shadow seemed to be feeding on it, drawing the dark liquid into itself, its form rippling in satisfaction. And as it did, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, more urgent. "Crazy. Help us, Help us. Evelyn's legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled backward, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. Her back hit the wall, and she froze, her heart racing as the room seemed to close in around her. She was trapped. The figure moved closer, its shadowy tendrils reaching for her, curling around the edges of the room like dark serpents. Its voice, once a whisper, was now a cacophony of desperate cries, overlapping and overlapping until they were nothing more than a tortured wail. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room was spinning, the walls warping, the air thick with dread. The whispers filled her ears, pounding in her skull, a relentless barrage of cries for help that tore at her sanity. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The figure halted in front of her, its tendrils retracting, its form becoming still once more. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared into the inky blackness where its face should have been. There was no face, no eyes to meet her gaze, but she could feel it. It was staring at her, waiting. The silence stretched, stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. The figure's arm, its tendril, extended toward her again, but this time, Evelyn didn't back away. She couldn't. She was frozen, her mind lost in a haze of terror and confusion. The figure stopped, just inches from her face, its shadowy presence pressing against her, cold and suffocating. And then, the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a plea. It wasn't a whisper. It was something darker. Help us, or join us. Evelyn's body went numb, the words seeping into her bones, filling her with a cold dread. The shadow's tendril reached out, brushing against her skin. The touch was icy, unnatural. She shuddered violently, her breath catching in her throat as the world around her seemed to tilt. A part of her wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But the other part, the part that felt drawn to the figure, to the dark liquid pooling at its feet, wanted to stay. It wanted to understand, to know why this was happening, to know what it wanted. The shadow seemed to sense her hesitation. It pulled back slightly, its form wavering, and Evelyn could hear the faintest echo of voices in the distance. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Steve Schwarber. Steve.Schwarber. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many. Hundreds, thousands. And they were all calling her name. The voices, thousands of them, filled Evelyn's mind. Her head throbbed with the pressure of their constant barrage. It wasn't just the whispering anymore. It was a roar, a cacophony of anguish, calling her, pulling her into the depths of their despair. Each voice was distinct, a fractured memory of someone lost, someone forgotten. Her head, help us. Please, don't leave us. Her legs felt weak, as if they might give way beneath her. The cold tendril of the shadow seemed to coil tighter around her, drawing her in. She tried to move, tried to step back, but her feet were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but something inside her kept her there. The figure in front of her had no face, no eyes, but Evelyn could feel it staring at her. She could feel its intent, its hunger, and she realized with a growing dread that it wasn't just trying to communicate, it was trying to consume her. Join us. The words echoed in her skull, each syllable sinking into her like a blade. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her chest tight, as if the very air in the room had turned to cement. Her body trembled, but it wasn't just fear that gripped her. There was something else, something more insidious, dark, gnawing emptiness. She wanted to understand, to know why this was happening, but with every passing second, the shadow's presence felt more oppressive, more suffocating. It wasn't just a thing in the room, it was the room. It was the very walls, the air, the floor beneath her feet. As she made her way to the bathroom, she silently prayed and the alligators would hide if they were in there. Lose everything. And it was waiting. The whispers grew louder, rising to a maddening crescendo until they were all Evelyn could hear. The room began to distort, the walls bending inward, as if the very structure of the hospital was collapsing around her. Her vision blurred, and she could feel herself being pulled forward, dragged into the center of the room by an invisible force. Her heart raced as the cold tendril wrapped around her arm, pulling her toward the dark, shifting figure. Her body moved against her will, her mind screaming for her to fight, but the fear had paralyzed her. Join us. The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. They burrowed into her skin, into her very soul, pulling her into the abyss. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity, her thoughts, her memories, all of it being drawn into the shadow, into the dark. Please, don't. Her voice cracked, but the words were useless. She was nothing more than a vessel now, a body, a thing to be consumed. The coldness of the shadow seeped into her skin, sinking deep into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the pressure stopped. The room returned to its previous state. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight that had filled it was gone. Evelyn stood frozen, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. Her hands were shaking as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The shadow figure was gone, but the whispers remained. They were no longer coming from the shadow. They were coming from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, they filled the room, a constant, maddening presence. Execution slowed to a standstill. Evelyn turned, her heart pounding in her chest. She stumbled toward the door, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She needed to get out. She needed to escape this place before it consumed her entirely. As her hand gripped the door handle, she froze. Something wasn't right. The door. It wasn't locked. She had locked it before. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned back to face the room. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, darker, more alive. The body that had been missing from the morgue drawer was now in the center of the room, its lifeless form twisted in an unnatural position. Its skin was pale, its eyes wide open and staring, but there was no life in them. No soul. It was just a body, but it wasn't alone. There were more. Dozens of bodies. No, not just bodies. Shapes, twisted and contorted, crawling across the floor, dragging themselves toward her. Their eyes, vacant and hollow, followed her every movement. Their mouths moved in unison, chanting in the same voice, the same words. Join us. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her. The door was right there. She could make it. She had to make it. But the shadows were closing in. They were crawling from the walls now, from the corners, from the very air. They were everywhere. The bodies moved faster now, their limbs jerking in grotesque, unnatural ways as they slowly made their way toward her, dragging themselves with an unholy determination. And still the voices came, louder and louder, filling her mind with their desperate plea. Join us. The door seemed so far away now, a distant dream. The shadows were all around her, their cold tendrils reaching out, wrapping around her ankles, her legs pulling her toward them. The bodies were close now, too close. Evelyn could feel their cold, lifeless hands brush against her skin as they dragged themselves toward her, their mouths open in silent screams. Her mind raced. There had to be something, some way to stop this. And then it hit her. The bodies, the morgue, the whispers, the shadows, they were all connected. She was being drawn into their world, into their torment. The morgue wasn't just a place where bodies were stored. It was a place of confinement, a place where the forgotten were trapped, their souls bound to the dark. And she was their next victim. Help us. The words came again, but this time they weren't just a plea, they were a command. Evelyn's heart raced. There was no escaping this, no way out. The shadows closed in, and Evelyn knew deep down that she was no longer in control. She was already a part of them. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears as she stood frozen, surrounded by the writhing bodies that had once been lifeless. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body betrayed her. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, like it was pressing down on her chest, forcing her to remain rooted to the spot. The shadows moved around her, cold and hungry, their tendrils wrapping tighter, squeezing the last remnants of hope from her. The bodies that had been scattered around the morgue were no longer still. They crawled, dragged themselves across the cold floor with unnerving speed, their eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto Evelyn, and for the first time, she felt the crushing weight of their gaze. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for her. The whispering, that constant, insidious murmuring, filled her mind again. The words twisted and warped until they were no longer words at all. They were feelings, raw emotions that crawled into her very soul. Fear, desperation, loneliness. Join us. The voices echoed in her skull, a chorus of broken souls pleading for release. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered backward, every part of her begging for escape. She needed to run. She needed to get out of this place, but her legs refused to move. The shadows were everywhere, closing in from every direction, wrapping around her like a vice. But she smiled as they slowly retreated before thickening mists and the color of smoke ripped. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight, as if the very air itself had turned against her. She was trapped. Help us. The words were no longer distant. They were inside her. She could feel them, crawling beneath her skin, tugging at her heart, urging her to listen, to understand. But what did it mean? What did they want from her? The bodies inched closer, their movements jerky, unnatural, as they dragged themselves toward her. Their skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that should have been long forgotten. Their mouths were open, but no sound came from them. Instead, their eyes, those empty, soul-sucking eyes, stared at Evelyn with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Her mind raced. She needed to think. There had to be something she could do, but all she could feel was the crushing weight of their presence, their desperate yearning for something she couldn't understand. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something caught her eye. At the far end of the morgue, behind a set of heavy metal doors, a faint light flickered. It wasn't much, just a sliver of pale blue light that seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm. But it was there, and in that moment, Evelyn knew. It was the only way out. Without thinking, she lurched forward, her feet dragging across the cold, polished floor. The shadows recoiled, but only for a moment. As if sensing her movement, they surged forward, their cold tendrils snapping at her ankles, pulling her back into the abyss. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought against the shadows, her arms flailing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the weight of the bodies behind her, the relentless pull of their cold hands, the suffocating presence that threatened to drag her into the darkness. Join us. The words came again, louder now, more insistent, and Evelyn felt the very walls of the morgue tremble as the shadows grew stronger, more powerful. They were alive, they were waiting, and they were not going to let her leave. Evelyn groaned, this time. No. For with every ounce of strength she had left, Evelyn pushed forward, her body shaking, her mind racing. The door. She had to reach the door. She debated for several seconds before deciding that The whispers became deafening, their voices crashing against her mind, tearing at her sanity. She could feel her resolve faltering, could feel the pull of the shadows wrapping around her like a tightening noose. But still, she fought. She fought with everything she had left, knowing that if she stopped, if she let them take her, she would never escape. Her hand slammed against the cold metal of the door, and for a brief moment she thought she was going to fall. But then, with a grunt, she twisted the handle, the door creaking open with a sound that felt like a death knell. Stress relief medication. Light flooded the room. The moment the door swung wide, Evelyn stumbled into the narrow corridor beyond. The shadows recoiled, their cold fingers retracting as if they feared the light. The whispers grew faint, distant, as if the very act of escaping the morgue had caused the darkness to lose its grip on her. But Evelyn didn't stop. She ran. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she sprinted down the corridor, the sound of her heart thundering in her chest, drowning out everything else. The air felt different here, fresher, more alive, but she knew it wouldn't last. The shadows were still out there, lurking in the corners, waiting for her to falter. The hallways twisted and turned, each door she passed offering no comfort, no refuge. Every step felt like it might be her last, the weight of the shadows still hanging over her. And then she saw it. At the end of the corridor, a staircase led upward, a faint light shining from above. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She took the stairs, two at a time, her breath ragged, her body screaming in exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Not until she reached the top. She burst through the door at the top of the stairs, emerging into what seemed like the upper floors of the hospital. The air was different here, less stifling, and the whispers were almost gone. She was out. She had made it. Or so she thought. Evelyn looked around, her heart still racing in her chest. The hospital was eerily silent now. Too silent. There was no one around. No nurses, no doctors. The hallway was empty, just rows of sterile rooms stretching in every direction. But as her gaze drifted to the far end of the hall, something caught her eye. Figure, standing in the shadows. It was too tall, too still. Evelyn's blood ran cold. And then it moved. Valencia's breath caught in her throat as the figure at the end of the hallway shifted. For a moment, it seemed to melt into the shadows, becoming a part of the darkness that clung to the corners of the hospital. Her mind raced, her heart pounding as she strained to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't just a figure. It was something unnatural. Her legs froze, her body refusing to obey her mind. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to get away from whatever that thing was. But she couldn't. The figure moved again, and this time it was closer. So much closer. Evelyn's pulse surged as the thing stepped into the dim light, revealing its shape more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretched out in awkward angles, as though its bones had been twisted beyond recognition. The skin was a sickly gray, like death had already claimed it. But it was alive, or at least it was moving. Its face. Evelyn recoiled at the sight. It had no eyes, just empty sockets, black as the void. But even though it couldn't see, she could feel it staring at her. The emptiness of its gaze burrowed into her, sinking deep into her very soul. She wanted to scream, to call out, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, stifling any sound. She couldn't even breathe properly. The thing took another step forward, its movements unnervingly slow, deliberate. The faintest sound echoed in the hallway, like the scrape of bone against tile, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. It was coming for her. Her feet finally obeyed her, but only for a moment. She turned to run, but as she did, she noticed something that froze her in place. The hospital around her seemed wrong. The walls were too close, the ceilings too low. The windows were boarded up, and there were no signs of life, no staff, no patients, just the empty, sterile corridors that stretched out like a maze, leading nowhere. The figure's presence loomed behind her, but Evelyn didn't dare turn around. She ran, her feet pounding the floor, her breaths ragged and shallow. The air was thick, like it was pressing against her chest, pushing the panic deeper into her heart. As she rounded a corner, she collided with something, a cold, unforgiving wall. But it wasn't a wall. It was a door. And it was slightly ajar. Evelyn hesitated, her mind screaming at her to keep running, but something, an overwhelming need for safety, pulled her toward it. She pushed the door open with trembling hands, and as she stepped inside, the room greeted her with a stifling silence. "Hey, nice work," Helen said under her breath, her voice ragged with terror. "Hey, nice work." The room was small, almost cramped. It looked like an office filled with old papers, files scattered across a desk, and a single lamp flickering dimly in the corner. The light seemed to offer her some sense of security, but it wasn't enough to calm her racing thoughts. She needed to get out. She needed to find a way to escape this nightmare. "Sorry," he said, and touched his finger to the glass to the window in the doorway. His words resonated slowly through the nightmare. The door behind her creaked, and Evelyn spun around, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Her body was drenched in sweat, her limbs heavy and shaking, but she dared not move. She didn't want to see it again. The thought of that thing with its empty sockets closing in on her filled her with a terror she couldn't describe. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. Evelyn took a few steps deeper into the room, her gaze scanning the cluttered desk. Among the papers, she saw something strange. A file, marked with a name she knew all too well. Evelyn Clark. Her breath hitched. She staggered toward the desk, reaching for the file. The moment her fingers brushed against the edges, she felt it, a chill creeping up her spine, as though someone, or something, was standing right behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, but she forced herself to open the file. The papers inside were old, yellowed with age, but they were clearly about her. There were notes, scribbled in a hurried hand, detailing her medical history. But something wasn't right. The dates didn't match up. The file wasn't just about her past. It was about things she couldn't remember. Procedures, tests, experiments. And the worst part? Her name wasn't the only one on the file. There were others. Many others. Names she didn't recognize. Faces she couldn't place. But they all had one thing in common. They were all patients of the same hospital. The same morgue. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. The last sheet sent a cold shiver down her spine. The photograph. It was an old picture, grainy and faded, but it was unmistakable. The figure from the hallway, standing in the shadows. Its twisted form was captured mid-step, its face obscured by the darkness. But Evelyn knew. She knew it was the same thing that had been following her. And worse yet, it was standing next to her. It was her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The figure wasn't just following her. It was her. Evelyn staggered back, the world spinning around her. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows in the room deepening, pressing against her skin. The whispers started again, louder now, a cacophony of voices that swirled in her mind, pulling her apart. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room was suffocating her. "Join us." The voice echoed inside her head louder than ever before. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a demand. The photo was proof. She wasn't running from the figure. She was running from herself. And then everything went black. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her body stiff and unyielding, as though she had been frozen in time. The darkness around her was oppressive, suffocating. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but her mind felt heavy, clouded, as if she had just woken from a nightmare too real to shake off. She tried to move, but the cold, hard surface beneath her, smooth, metallic, held her in place. Panic surged within her. Her hands shot out, but they met resistance. She was trapped. A muffled sound filled the air, like distant whispers, but they weren't distant. They were close. Very close. Too close. Evelyn struggled to sit up, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized she was no longer in the small office. She wasn't even in the hallway anymore. She was in the morgue. Her breath hitched as she looked around, her eyes straining in the low light. Rows upon rows of cold steel drawers lined the walls. The morgue, the place where the dead were kept, the place she had tried so hard to escape from. But now she was back. The whispers grew louder, rising in intensity. But they weren't just voices. No, they were something else, a strange hum that vibrated through her very bones. The sound seemed to call to her, pulling her deeper into the darkness, into the heart of the morgue. She was lost in the darkness, and she felt as if she were huddled in a clothing eggshell. She pushed herself up, her legs unsteady as she staggered to her feet. Her hands gripped the cold steel table beside her for support, her fingers brushing against something wet. She pulled her hand back, and when she looked at it, her skin paled. Blood. The blood wasn't hers. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't alone. Evelyn turned slowly, scanning the room. There were no other figures at first, no visible presence in the shadows, but she felt it. The presence. It lingered, thick and suffocating, like the air itself was alive with the weight of the forgotten. The drawers, the bodies. She moved toward them, her body trembling with every step. She couldn't help it. She had to see, she had to know. She reached for the first drawer, her fingers brushing against the cold handle, the metal smooth and unforgiving. "Exercise," he said. It opened with a quiet, grating sound, the drawer sliding out effortlessly. And then she saw it. The body inside was covered in a white sheet, but there was something unmistakable about it. The shape, the proportions, the twisted limbs, the gray, sickly skin. It was the same thing, the same figure she had seen in the hallway, the same thing that had been following her, but this one was dead. Evelyn recoiled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She backed away, only to find that every drawer she opened held the same figure, twisted, gray, dead, and each one had a name. Names she didn't recognize, but names she had seen before, on the file, on the photograph. Her own name was written on a tag, hanging loosely from the drawer. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the tag. Evelyn Clark. The same name that had been on the file, the same name she had seen in the photograph. But this body wasn't her. She wasn't dead. She couldn't be. Could she? The thought crashed into her mind like a tidal wave, overwhelming her. The whispers grew louder now, deafening, a chorus of voices chanting her name over and over. Evelyn, Skebelem. Her pulse raced as the temperature in the room dropped, the cold seeping into her bones. Her breath fogged in front of her, but the chill wasn't from the morgue. No, it was something else, something unnatural. The drawers started to move, slowly, creaking open one by one. A single hand, pale and lifeless, emerged from the nearest drawer. Evelyn gasped and stumbled back, her body crashing into another drawer, knocking it open. Another hand, this one thin and twisted, with fingers too long, too bony. It grasped at the edge of the drawer, pulling itself free. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. It was as if she were paralyzed, held captive by the sight before her. The dead bodies, the twisted forms, were all awakening. Their eyes were empty, black holes staring at her, watching her every move. They were reaching for her. Her legs gave out beneath her and she fell to the floor with a crash. The sound echoed through the morgue, but the dead didn't stop. They continued to crawl from their drawers, their movements slow but deliberate, their hands outstretched, grasping for her. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening roar. The dead were speaking to her, their voices like the wind, their words twisted and fragmented. Join us, join us. Evelyn covered her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside her mind now. She could feel them all around her, their cold, dead hands brushing against her skin. Join us, Evelyn. Her heart pounded in her chest as the bodies continued to close in, their eyes locked on hers. They were not just bodies. They were memories. Forgotten souls, all victims of the hospital's twisted secrets. The truth began to settle in her mind. These weren't just patients. They weren't just bodies. They were the souls of the forgotten, those who had been experimented on, discarded, left to die in the dark corners of the morgue. And now they were calling her. Join us, Evelyn. The voice wasn't coming from the bodies. It was coming from within her. Her hand trembled as she reached out, touching her own chest. Her heart was still beating. She was alive, but she felt empty, hollow. The morgue had become her prison, and there was no escape. Not anymore. Evelyn's breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. The coldness in the room wasn't just physical anymore. It had seeped into her soul, wrapping around her like an invisible chain. Her mind raced, but the whispers, the voices, they refused to stop. Ash. 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 Join us, Evelyn. Join us. The words slithered through her thoughts like a venomous snake, squeezing the life out of her. Her hands still rested on her chest, as if trying to reassure herself that her heart was still beating. She was alive. But the longer she stayed in this morgue, surrounded by the twisted dead figures reaching for her, the more she felt her own humanity slipping away. The bodies, no, the souls, were all around her now, moving in slow, agonizing motions, dragging themselves toward her. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes black pits, and their mouths were contorted into grotesque smiles. Some were half-rotted, others unnervingly pristine, but all of them shared the same expression, an unholy hunger, exhaling lungs like monsters, an unhellishly pristine smile. Evelyn could feel their cold hands grazing her skin. Their touch was like ice crawling across her skin, leaving behind a trail of frost. She jerked back, but her body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror that consumed her. "Will you hear?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. The whispers continued, a maddening chorus that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. "You know why. You know." The realization hit her like a blow to the gut. She wasn't just in the morgue because she had stumbled upon a dark secret. No, this place, this room, was meant for her. The whispers, the bodies, the forgotten souls. They had all been waiting for her. She had all been waiting for the reason a lot of them had given up halfway through. The whispers, the bodies, the forgotten souls. They had all been waiting for her. They had been waiting for her to uncover the truth. She was no different from them. The thought was too much. She shook her head violently, her eyes darting around the room as she tried to make sense of it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she staggered to her feet, ignoring the cold hands that reached for her, brushing her legs. She couldn't let them touch her again. "Get away from me," she screamed, her voice breaking. The dead didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to paralyze her. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. Her gaze fell on the file she had seen earlier, the one with her name, the one that had led her here. The truth, she realized, was buried in that file, but what was it? What had she missed? What had the hospital hidden? The whispers grew more insistent, clawing at her mind. Look at the file, Evelyn." She stumbled toward the desk, her hands shaking as she grabbed the file. She could barely read the words through the blur of tears in her eyes, but she forced herself to focus, the words beginning to swim into clarity. Patient. Evelyn Clark. It felt wrong. This couldn't be real. She wasn't a patient. She was a nurse who had been working at the hospital for months. But the file told a different story. It was dated years ago, a long time before she had even started working there. The page turned and her breath caught in her throat. The photograph was there again, the one she had seen earlier, her own face. But the woman in the photo wasn't the same. She was younger, but her eyes were hollow, lifeless. The whispers rose again, louder now, drowning out her thoughts. She tried to ignore them, but they filled her mind like a tide, pushing her to read further. Evelyn Clark, patient, deceased, cause of death, experimental procedure. Her heart skipped a beat, her hands trembled as she turned the page, the weight of the words crushing her. The hospital, the morgue, everything was a lie. She wasn't alive. Not really. She was dead. A ghost. A shadow. Her memories, her life, everything had been erased, manipulated. She had been a part of their experiments, the ones that no one spoke of, the ones that the hospital had buried deep in the darkest corners of the morgue. The visitor had watched her die. The life in her heart had been erased from their computers. The body in the drawer, the twisted figure that had been following her, that was her. She had been here before. She had been one of the forgotten. Evelyn gasped, clutching her chest as a wave of nausea hit her. She staggered back, her vision swimming as the truth unfolded before her. She was nothing but a product of their experiments, a forgotten soul trapped in a place that didn't belong to the living. The whispers had been right. She was one of them, one of the dead. "Join us, Evelyn." The sound of her name sent a jolt of panic through her. She couldn't let it happen. She couldn't become one of them. She slammed the file shut, but it was too late. The darkness around her had deepened. The shadows twisted, and the figures, no longer just bodies but souls, were closing in, surrounding her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw something beyond them, something far worse, a figure in the corner of the room, a tall, imposing figure, its face hidden in shadow. The figure stretched forward, grabbing the ball of wire that lay on the floor in front of them. It wasn't one of the dead. It wasn't one of the forgotten. It was something worse, something that had been watching her all along. The figure moved, stepping out of the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the dark. Evelyn felt her heart race. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the figure reached for her. Its hand was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. She glanced at her watch and realized that it had been reading the time on the phone book. The dead were all around her now, their hollow eyes fixed on her, waiting. But this figure, this thing wasn't just waiting. It was hungry. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as the figure in the corner of the room took another step toward her. The air seemed to grow even colder, the darkness itself pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the dead that surrounded her anymore. This presence, this thing, was something else entirely. Her mind reeled as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, its tall frame casting an unnerving shadow across the morgue's walls. The dim light from the flickering bulb above was not enough to fully reveal its features, but the feeling of malevolence it exuded was unmistakable. It wasn't human. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears, drowning out the sounds of her surroundings. Her legs felt like lead, as if the very air was weighing her down, forcing her to stay rooted to the spot. It was only when the figure moved closer that she saw its eyes, or rather, the lack of them. Where its eyes should have been, there was nothing but empty darkness, a void that seemed to consume everything around it. The scream lulled the two creatures to the ground. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't move. Her limbs were paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped her. It wasn't just the fear of death that kept her frozen. It was the overwhelming sense that this thing, this creature, had been waiting for her all along, that it was connected to her in ways she couldn't understand, ways that went beyond life and death. Knew it. Evelyn. The voice that came from the figure wasn't spoken aloud. It reverberated in her mind, cold and distant, like a memory she had tried to forget. It was the same voice she had heard in the whispers, but this time it was more powerful, more demanding. She tried to speak, to plead, but her throat felt tight, her words caught in her chest. The creature moved closer, its form shimmering in and out of existence, like it wasn't entirely bound to this reality. Its presence twisted the air around her, distorting the light and shadows. "You were never meant to escape," the voice echoed, reverberating in her skull. "You were always ours." Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for something, anything that could help her escape. The bodies, the forgotten souls, were still there, but they were no longer the focus of her terror. The figure had taken their place. It was the true threat. It was the thing that had been lurking in the dark corners of the morgue, the thing that had been feeding off the souls of the dead, growing stronger with each passing year. "Who are you?" Evelyn managed to croak, her voice barely a whisper. The creature's lips, if they could even be called that, curled into a grotesque smile, though it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something far more sinister, something that carried the weight of centuries of darkness. "I am the one who watches," it replied, its voice sending a shiver down her spine. "I am the one who keeps the forgotten. And now, Evelyn, you are mine." A cold, icy grip wrapped around her heart. Her pulse raced, but her body refused to react. She was trapped. She had no way out. The creature had claimed her. Suddenly, the morgue seemed to distort, as if the walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering, the very ground beneath her feet beginning to shift. The shadows writhed like living things, crawling along the floor, up the walls, consuming everything in their path. The dead bodies that had once been silent and still began to stir again. But this time they weren't just moving, they were reaching for her. Their hands were outstretched, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow with hunger. Evelyn's mind screamed in panic, but she could barely process what was happening. The dead, the figure, the whispers, all of it had become one suffocating presence, a storm of terror closing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it. The sound of her own name. Not a whisper, but a scream, a cry for help. "Evelyn, you have to wake up." The voice was familiar, But it didn't belong to the creature. It didn't belong to the dead. It was someone else. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, and she was no longer in the morgue. The darkness that had surrounded her faded away, replaced by the bright, sterile lights of the hospital hallway. She was back. They worked, but the recovery went faster this time. She grabbed her sleeping child and clung tightly to the precious wrist links which pulled the recovering child to the real world. But the relief was short-lived. The feeling of the creature's presence still lingered, like a shadow clinging to her mind. The air around her was heavy, oppressive. The hallway stretched out in front of her, but it felt wrong, unnatural. It was the same place, but not the same. Her body shook as she took a step forward, the realization hitting her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't free, not yet. Evelyn. The voice came again, this time from behind her. She turned, her eyes wide with terror. It was Dr. Harris, the same doctor who had been treating her before she had stumbled into the morgue. But there was something off about him. His eyes were too wide, his smile too sharp. "Come with me," he said, his voice cold, devoid of warmth. "It's time for your final treatment." Evelyn's heart stopped. The memories, the truth, it all rushed back in a flood. The morgue, the whispers, the dead. Dr. Harris wasn't just a doctor. He was part of it all. He had been a part of the experiments. He had known what they were doing. He had been the one to trap her here. "No," she whispered, backing away from him. "No, you can't do this." Dr. Harris didn't answer. He simply took a step toward her, his grin widening. "Come," he repeated, his voice growing darker. "You can't escape us, Evelyn. You never could." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as Dr. Harris's cold, calculating gaze locked onto hers. She could feel the oppressive weight of his presence bearing down on her, the same sensation she had felt in the morgue, as if the shadows themselves were creeping toward her. Her skin prickled, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. She wasn't free. Not yet. The sterile lights above flickered ominously, casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe, distorting the hallway into something far more sinister. She tried to step back, but her legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by something far greater than fear. She was trapped. Again. Dr. Harris took another step forward, his eyes widening in anticipation. "You've been running for so long, Evelyn," he said softly, his voice now carrying a venomous undertone. "But the truth is, you can't escape what's already inside you." The words hit her like a blow to the stomach, inside her. The thought gnawed at her, pulling at the threads of her sanity. What was he talking about? Was she part of something bigger than she had ever realized? The morgue, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They had all been real, and they had been leading her to this moment. Purple fog rose around Pearl as they walked to the morgue. Dribbling eyes darted to the walls around her. The once familiar hallway now seemed endless, stretching on forever, its features warping and twisting as though the very building itself was alive. The cold draft that had brushed against her earlier now felt like icy fingers running along her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the building, the doctor, or something far worse, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no escape. Subject number 1. Date September 30th, 2011. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "I'm not part of whatever sick game you're playing." Dr. Harris smiled, but it wasn't the comforting, professional smile he had once worn. It was something darker. "You've always been part of it, Evelyn. You've always been the one we've been waiting for. You were never meant to leave." Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fall into place. The morgue, the dead, the whispers. It was all connected to her, wasn't it? She had thought it was all just a nightmare, but now she realized the truth. She was being pulled into something far beyond her control. The figure in the morgue, the thing that had been waiting for her, it wasn't just a manifestation of fear. It was real, and now it was here, in this very hospital, waiting for her to make a choice. Exercise. Her breath hitched as the floor beneath her seemed to shift. The shadows lengthened, creeping toward her, curling around her ankles like tendrils, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The voices, the whispers began to return, low and guttural, rising from the very walls themselves. She could hear them now, clearer than ever, as if they were speaking directly to her mind. "Join us," they murmured, the voices blending into one collective chant. "You can't escape. You belong here. You always have." Evelyn's mind spun. She tried to push the voices out, to ignore the creeping sensation of the shadows wrapping tighter around her. But they weren't just whispers anymore. They were becoming commands, demands. Dr. Harris's voice cut through the rising tide of whispers. "You have a choice, Evelyn. You can join us, or you can become one of us. The choice is yours." Her pulse quickened, the weight of his words sinking in. This was no longer about running, no longer about surviving. This was about something far darker, something ancient and malevolent. She wasn't just trapped in a hospital anymore. She was standing at the threshold of something much worse. Her mind flashed to the morgue, to the bodies that had once been silent and still, to the figure that had watched her. It had all been leading her here, to this moment. She wasn't sure if she could fight it anymore, if she could run. Could she really escape the fate that had been woven for her, or was this her destiny? Suddenly, a low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows. The temperature dropped even further, the chill biting at her skin. The figure, the one from the morgue, began to materialize in the darkness behind Dr. Harris, its shape growing more distinct with each passing second. Its empty eyes locked onto hers, its smile stretching impossibly wide. It was no longer a whisper. It was an unmistakable presence, one that was closer than ever before. Evelyn's legs gave way beneath her, her body trembling uncontrollably as she sank to her knees. The weight of the situation, of everything, crushed her. She could feel the pull, the invisible strings that had been tugging at her all this time. She was slipping, losing herself to the dark, to the unknown. But then something inside her snapped. The fear, the helplessness, the sense of being lost. Evelyn could feel it all. But now, in this moment, it wasn't enough to control her. It wasn't enough to keep her from making a choice. She had always been afraid, but now she had to face the truth. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about reclaiming control. She took a deep, shaky breath. Her eyes lifted to Dr. Harris's face, and for the first time she saw him for what he truly was. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't someone who could save her. He was a part of the darkness, and she wasn't going to let him, or it, win. "You don't get to decide for me," Evelyn said, her voice steady now, stronger than it had ever been before. "I'm not yours." In that instant, she felt it. The shift. The air around her seemed to crack, the shadows recoiling, the whispers fading into silence. The figure in the dark screamed in fury, but Evelyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was free. With one final determined step, Evelyn turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if there was a way out of this hospital or if she would ever truly escape. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was moving forward, not backward. And as she ran, she realized one thing above all. The darkness had been inside her all along, but it was her choice whether to let it consume her or to keep fighting. And she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The end.